My name's Shane Fisher. I'm the Boomi practice manager for Big Compass. I've been working in the Boomi space for somewhere around 6 years, and have worked with Salesforce quite a bit. In fact, I was just reminiscing with Aaron earlier that I was integrating with Salesforce probably 15 years ago, back from the Web Methods platform. So fun stuff. It's been around for a long time, and it's been fun kind of watching it grow as a platform. Okay, so let's jump into it. So this is kind of what I plan to cover for this event. So we're going to start with some basic integration concepts, kind of in the Salesforce space. We're going to kind of double click on kind of this topic of events within Salesforce. Like, what are events? How do we use them? What are the different types of events? Then we'll get into the Boomi use cases. So I've got 3 demos. And then after that, we'll follow it up with a little bit of wrap up, and I'll share some of the reference material that I used. Any questions on that so far? Okay, moving right along. So let's start with some basic Salesforce integration concepts. So when we're integrating with Salesforce, there's obviously a ton of different things to think about. And these are kind of some of the main buckets of considerations when choosing sort of an integration pattern. Salesforce has a lot of kind of inbuilt technology that enables getting data into or out of it, as well as the Boomi platform. We'll take a look at some of those capabilities later on, but there's native connectors, there's pub sub capability, scalability, kind of all those good things. And so this is kind of the universe of things that to sort of consider. Sorry, did somebody have a question? Okay. So let's start with pushing versus pulling. So this is kind of an interesting thing that we like to kind of consider in terms of the direction of the data flow. For most of these use cases, we're going to be concerned with getting data out of Salesforce, but obviously Salesforce has a lot of capabilities to push data in both directions. And the other point of clarification that I kind of like to drive home is that there's a difference between direction of invocation and then the direction that the data is actually flowing. So in a pull scenario, a source is pulling data from a target. And so the direction of data flow is actually, from the target to the source. But the invocation is opposite of that. When we're pushing data, the data flow and the invocation is kind of the same direction. And so those are kind of the 2 main categories of directionality. So in terms of when these are best to use from a Salesforce perspective, so when we're pulling data, typically we're just using the Salesforce APIs to query data. And we do that on sort of an on-demand basis. This works best for batch scenarios and on-demand use cases. And it's probably the least complex in terms of all the different strategies for getting data out of Salesforce. Lowest number of moving parts. You're basically just dealing with the Salesforce API. You have some sort of a consumer or a connector. On the Boomi platform specifically, we're going to be working with a connector, and then you have a target system. So that one's fairly simple. Pushing data, we typically do that through events, and we're going to talk about that next. This is a little bit more complex, but it also solves some more complex problems. So, in this scenario, we're typically creating triggers. We're sending events to a target. And then this works generally very well for event-driven synchronization use cases. So that means when something of interest happens in an organization, let's say a new account gets created or a new opportunity gets created within Salesforce, and we want to have near real-time notification of that throughout the enterprise, that's where sort of this pattern works really well. From a skills and complexity standpoint, as I said, this one's a little bit more difficult, requires a little bit deeper knowledge of Salesforce, and In terms of complexity, certainly more components to kind of work through. Okay, now let's talk integration type. So Salesforce sort of defines these three major categories of integration, and I like their perspective on this because it helps sort of clarify need, right? So you have process integrations, data integrations, and then the most interesting one to me is the virtual integration, which we'll talk about in a bit. But typically process integration is really about integrating a workflow or triggering a process across multiple systems. So some examples of that would be like a new hire workflow where an employee record has to be created across a number of different systems, order fulfillment, creating a new account within a sales organization, where that data has to be transmitted across organizations or across systems. So this category is really focused on integrating a workflow or a process. The middle bucket is, they call it data integration. And this is really, as the name implies, really more focused on the data than it is the process. And so examples of this are, customer mastering or MDM use cases. If you, from a Salesforce standpoint, very typical use case is, an organization that has multiple Salesforce instances. It's a hard thing to say. And parent-child organizations and having to sort of sync those all together. And then finally, your most classic use case in this category is really around BI or EDW. So, moving large volumes of data. It's not about process. It's just about getting the data to where we want it to be. And then this last bucket, which is very interesting, is virtual integration. So Salesforce rolled a new capability a couple of years ago called external data or external objects. And what this basically allows you to do is reference data in external systems without having the data resident within Salesforce, which is a bit of a paradigm shift because anytime we're thinking about, needing to display data in the UI, we automatically assume, oh, that data's got to be resident. We've got to integrate it. We've got to pull that data in. With this capability, you're actually not pulling the data in. You're connecting to an external source and presenting it through the UI. So typical, scenarios where I've seen this is in the customer service space. So if somebody's working on a case and they want to see case notes that may be stored off system, in a different like case management tool, instead of having to natively integrate that data, they can just sort of display it. Searching for order history between Salesforce and an ERP is another good example of this. And generally any sort of use case where you want to replace sort of that, old school showing an external system in a window sort of a paradigm. Okay, so that's integration types. So now let's explore a little bit on Salesforce Events. So we referenced this earlier, and this is kind of the most modern way to integrate with Salesforce, I would say. So this is quite complex, and I'm not going to drain this entire table. I'll leave that for folks to go back and take a look later or reference the recording. But I will call out some specific things. So across the top here, you see 4 different sort of event buckets or event categories that Salesforce offers. And then these are all sort of capabilities across those different event types. Without sort of draining this too much, the main bucket that we're going to talk about is platform events. Number one, because Boomi has a native connector for it. And then also just because it's, it has some of these core capabilities that we like from an integration standpoint. So in particular, if you want to define your own event schema, which basically means defining the message that's going to be transmitted on a published scenario, platform events allow you to do that. Some of these other event types, you automatically get an event structure based on the kind of data you're trying to sync. And then this platform events also provides capability to define your own business logic around when you want to send the event in the form of an Apex trigger. And again, some of these other event types don't allow that. And then kind of just the final thing that I want to say on this is that CDC is one of the newest event types. And that's, change data capture. You've probably heard this term thrown around a lot. It's basically a standard sort of integration pattern that's mostly used for picking up changes to data objects. So Salesforce added that as a capability, not currently supported in Boomi, but fully expect it will be soon because they're pretty on top of Salesforce capabilities. So right now, if you wanted to do something like that, it would be probably custom code. I'm going to pause there because I've been talking for a bit. Any questions so far? Okay, moving on. Okay, so I did want to give some treatment to this notion of outbound events. So this is sort of an older Salesforce capability. And when I say older, I was using this like 15 years ago. It's been around forever. I like to call it kind of the Nickelback method of integration because it's kind of a soapish early 2000s, pattern. It's really kind of, focused on standing up SOAP APIs externally that Salesforce integrates with, where you essentially have to match a WSDL that Salesforce provides. This capability is still within Salesforce, but not as heavily used anymore. Okay, cool. So Boomi use cases. So the first one we're going to show is, again, going back and referencing some of the patterns we talked about. This is going to be kind of the simpler pull use case, where we're just going to leverage the Boomi Salesforce connector, which under the covers is essentially using the partner WSDL, and is really focused on kind of those batch-oriented use cases. So this one's pretty simple. We'll do this one pretty quickly because there's other more interesting ones to get to. Okay, so you can see here, this is essentially the Boomi platform. And I know there's probably some folks on the call that are not familiar with Boomi, so I'll try to just briefly describe kind of what you're looking at. For those of you who are well steeped in Boomi, just bear with us for a moment. So what we're looking at here is essentially the IDE for Boomi. So one of, in my opinion, one of the strengths of this platform is that there is no separate IDE you have to download and install. Your IDE is your web browser. Everything you need to do is a combination of working within your web browser and using the what's called the Atomsphere APIs on the back end. And so most everything that you can do via the web browser is also supported directly via an API, which is nice because that really contributes to the things that you can automate on the platform. Okay, so what we're looking at here on the left, this is just a set of folders that have different components and process flows in them. This is a specific process flow demonstrating using the Salesforce connector. So we'll go ahead and issue a test. So one thing to note while this is running is that I've got this set up right now to actually run off of a local, what's called an atom. And that's basically the Java runtime that's running off of my laptop right now. You can also run this off of the cloud. There's cloud atoms. And there's hybrid models as well. Okay, so basically called Salesforce to get a bunch of opportunities. Let's see if we got those. Source data. And you can see here's our opportunities that are coming through. And of course, they're in XML format. That's kind of one of the fun things of working with the Salesforce connector in Boomi is that it's still on XML, doesn't use JSON. But it's a very simple transformation to turn that into JSON. Okay, so that was super simple. Any questions about that? Didn't think there would be. Okay. Now, let's talk near real time. So we said, you know, there was sort of the pull methodology. Now we're going to talk about push methodology, and specifically platform events is what we're going to be exploring. So in this scenario, the idea is that new or opportunities within Salesforce that move to a one state, we want to get those propagated to other systems in the enterprise. This one is sent in near real time. And the event that actually gets published is kind of a skinny down version of the object. And in this scenario, we're actually going to have Boomi call back to get to enrich that object with more data. And then finally, we'll wrap that up by publishing all that data to a Slack channel. Okay. So if I go into my, actually, let me show you really quick some of the components, starting with this. So within Salesforce, this is the setup page. If you just search for platform events, it shows up right there. Okay. You can see I've got two defined. We're going to be kind of looking at the opportunity event. So pretty much all kind of standard stuff. This is the Salesforce UI labels, object name, API name, things like that. And then these are the customized fields. Remember we said before that platform events is one of the few event types that actually allow you to define your own message. And so this is essentially defining what that message looks like. And so you can see, you know, we're going to pass account ID, amount, description, some other data. Okay. So that's the structure of the event. And then there's also a trigger that underlies this. And essentially what happens there is when this condition is met, it will actually add this event to a list. It actually creates a new event, adds it to a list, and then it publishes it on the event bus. So within Salesforce, there's this thing called the event bus that's actually used by most of the event types within Salesforce. In fact, change data capture actually uses the event bus as well. Yeah, so that's how that works. So you can see the logic in here is we're going to look for opportunities that are closed. And am I missing something? Is one. Oh, it is one. Sorry. That's what I was looking for. So we don't want the ones that are closed lost. We just want the ones that are won, because we're going to celebrate those. Okay. So that's essentially how all of that works. In here, I'm actually in the developer workbench. And what this is just kind of a way to snoop. This is essentially another subscriber to the same topic within Salesforce. And so we should, when we make this change, we should see that propagate both through here and then also through Boomi. Okay. Let's see. So let's pick an opportunity. Okay. Okay. So we're staging the data so that this one isn't in a one state right now. But now let's say somebody comes in here and marks it as one. Okay. So what we should see is within the Boomi platform, we should see it come through, and we should also see it within developer workbench. Okay, and you can see this is the event coming through from a Boomi standpoint. Again, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Boomi platform, these are where all process logging is done. And a number of things you can click on in here, but the main thing is this brings up the specific logs for that execution. You can see the connectors and then the data that flows through it. Okay. We should see within Slack, we should see that data come through. So in the Boomi demo channel, you can see, yep, we definitely got some data that came through. Okay, so yep, new one opportunity, express logistics, standby generator. Okay. And then let's just double check and make sure we also saw it in the developer workbench. And we probably didn't because I was unsubscribed. Damn it. Sorry, guys. Well, let's just do another one. We got time. A different one. Okay. And you can see this is the actual event structure that comes through from a platform event standpoint. Any questions on that so far? Okay. Okay. So final topic. Let's see here. Okay. So use case 3. So this one is kind of a little known kind of a feature of Boomi. Again, there's an Atosphere API that underlies pretty much all Boomi functionality. And what that does is it enables us to do a lot of cool automation and things like that. So what I'm doing here is essentially a combination of a push and a pull. Now, why would I do that? This seems kind of weird. This works really well in cases where you want to do an event-driven batch. So let's say a common use case here is where the business says, I need this data reflected in near real time, but let's say the source is not able to do an event necessarily. We want to do it on a button click. So what this enables us to do is essentially kick off an integration within Boomi based on something happening within the source system without using sort of event-driven functionality. So this is, again, kind of a combination of both a push and a pull. So how this works is within, sorry, you get to, there we go. So within Postman, I'm actually going to call externally the API that kicks off a Boomi process. And that Boomi process is actually going to search for accounts that match the name that I provided. And then what it should do is dump those to Slack. Okay, whoops, sorry, need to hide that. Do that one more time. Okay, so I got a 200 status, okay. So what this enables us to do is essentially we don't have to stand up our own API if we're just trying to kick off a process. So it's very simple process orchestration. So I can see in Slack, yep, got more stuff coming in. And so there you go. And all that is actually doing is calling our Boomi process that we demoed earlier. So we're just invoking this not from the UI, we're actually invoking it from an API instead. Okay, I flew through all that stuff pretty quickly. Here's some references that are, if somebody wants to, kind of build some of this on your own. There's a lot here, but there's a lot of Salesforce documentation that's extremely helpful for understanding some of this. If I were to call your attention to some that are particularly enlightening, this one is essentially the integration Bible for Salesforce. They do a really good job of kind of breaking down all the different patterns the different considerations to think about, and APIs, all of that. So this is a really good starting place. From a tooling standpoint, obviously we're using Boomi and Salesforce. If you don't have a Salesforce account, they are free to sign up for at developer.salesforce.com. Highly recommend that. I've been using the same Salesforce account now for probably a decade, so they don't expire. And then finally, workbench.developerforce.com, which is another really good tool for doing kind of lower level stuff. All right, that's kind of what I've got. I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Sorry, I flew through this pretty quickly.
Shane, I'm aware of a use case. It's also push and pull in that order where I believe it was a platform event that had a limit on the size of the object that platform event could publish, and then Boomi, for example, could consume. So what I had come up with, I want to sort of run it by you and see if you think you would do the same, was just publishing the ID of that particular object. And then in Boomi, for example, here you would go based on that ID and pull that object from Salesforce in your flow. I'm not aware of another way to do that, but I'm curious if you have any other ideas, or if you would confirm that would be a good way to do that.
Yeah, I actually, thanks for bringing that up. So technically speaking, the what we demoed actually was a push and pull. Sorry, this guy. There actually was a pull after this, and it's for that reason. And so technically, I could have. Sorry, let me bring up that flow just so we can talk about it. So technically, I don't need to do this. So I could pretty much get all the data that I want in this use case just from the platform event itself, if I wanted to kind of spec that out. But to your point, you will reach a limit, and so perfectly acceptable to kind of have a skinnier message and then go back and pull for it. In fact, I've seen certain enterprises have use cases around this specific to security. So the typical pushback is, gee, if I really don't want, the events that are coming out of Salesforce, if somebody were to snoop one of those, it has the keys to the kingdom. Like, I've got account IDs, I've got account names, I've got all this proprietary information in them that I don't want to sort of expose. And so by doing more of a skinny message approach, you can just publish skinny messages with an ID and maybe an action like, new, create, update, delete, or something like that, and then have the downstream logic sort of deal with the rest of it. So that's one use case where you would do that. Another use case where I've actually applied this technique was to get unblocked from a design time perspective. So I was working on part of a team where they were defining a bunch of custom objects, and they couldn't produce a schema for those objects. They literally changed every 5 minutes. And this sort of a design pattern is a sort of a way around that, because you can build out most of your flow to respond to a skinny message that just has an ID. Like, that's a super easy thing to agree on, and then have the complexity be later on in the flow, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah. Are there any bottleneck considerations that we should be aware of on pulling the data?
Salesforce does have limits in terms of how many API calls you can make, but honestly, unless you're talking millions of API calls, you're not likely to touch those limits.
Okay, thanks. That's good info.
Yeah.
Hey, Shane, could you talk a little bit about the Salesforce connector in Boomi? I'm not sure. Do they charge for those? Is the only charge using it? Can anyone go in there and sign up for a free account and just use, and the Salesforce connector is just there for them? Or how would you get started with that?
Yep, great question. So Boomi does charge by the connector. Its licensing model is actually different than a lot of other platforms in that way, where they basically charge The connector essentially represents a system that you're talking to. And so they charge by the number of connectors you have. But the nice thing is that once you have those connectors, it's all you can eat across that connection. So they don't, at least in the integration product, it varies on some of the other products, but within integration, it's essentially all you can eat for the connectors that you've got. To your other question about, can you sign up for like a free Boomi account? Yes, absolutely. And I think the free account, you've got up to 3 or 4 connectors. I'd have to take a look at this one and see, but yeah, so you should be able to do exactly what I'm doing here with a free account. In fact, this is a free account. So
cool. Yeah, that connector seems like a really powerful thing. As someone who's done some integration with Salesforce using custom code, it'd be nice to not have to do that.
yeah, exactly.
Especially as you're talking about that SOAP.
Yeah. Now I will caution you that they do the free tier of this expires after 30 days. But I've been on this instance for 3 years now, something like that, because I just keep going in and you can extend it. There's essentially a request process to get it extended. So
cool. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? These are good questions.